What's up? What's up? Time to talk World War II. Hopefully you watched the videos on Saipan, and learned a few things. I hope you missed class. Hope you missed talking about history every day. At least a little bit, maybe. I do. That's got to count for something. So today we're going to go back to the PowerPoint, and I noticed my secretary made another mistake with the notes, because I didn't leave a space between the Mariana Islands and the Philippines, the retaking of the Philippines. So I'm sorry. Hopefully you still have that extra sheet of paper I told you about the other day, and you can use that because I didn't leave you any space. Sorry. All right, so what we're looking at here, this is a map of the Pacific. And so here's Hawaii, then down to the Marshall Islands, and now we're getting towards the Mariana Islands over here, where we want to be able to bomb Japan, the main island of Japan. Now MacArthur, you see here, General MacArthur's forces, he's going up to New Guinea because his mission is to retake the Philippines. And that's a personal mission. He wants to retake it to save the men that he left there, the men of the Bataan Peninsula. So it's like a personal vendetta for him. That's not necessary. We could have bypassed the Philippines and to get to Japan, but we'll talk about that more later probably. Oops. All right, going forward. Here's another map, gives you a little closer look. We're looking at Saipan right here in the Marianas, 3 main islands, Guam, which we lost, remember, right by Pearl Harbor. That's one of the islands that we got from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War. And then Tinian, and then Saipan. Those are the islands there. And so that's where we're going, June 1944. So here's a B-29 Super Fortress. Hopefully you enjoyed the little video I shared the other day of Doc and Fifi, 2 B-29s that have been restored and can still be flown today. This is the Norden bomb site. Maybe you saw that in the B-29 video. And this was a top secret bombing site that was developed by a Swiss engineer in the 1930s. And it was so top secret, it had special charges installed into it so that if a plane crashed, it would blow up. The bombardiers who used it were sworn to secrecy, that even if they were tortured, they could never say anything about it. It was on lock and key until it was installed in the plane. It was crazy because it was supposed to be like, they said the advertisement was they could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet in the air. Now, under ideal conditions, maybe they could do that. But as you can see from the site down here, the bomber is looking at these crosshairs to decide, and he has to enter in, altitude and speed and these things into this bomb site. And it's supposed to tell him when to drop the bombs, but you needed visual contact. When you watch the video at the part where it shows you like the day, a little bit after D-Day, when our bombers accidentally dropped bombs on our own guys, killing several hundred in the Normandy region of France, it was because some of these bombardiers are looking through their crosshairs, and all the billowing smoke from the previous bombers obscured their view of the target. So the bombing site only really worked well under great conditions. Now here's the ironic thing. We kept this thing deep secret, lock and key, all that stuff. And try to keep it to make sure the Germans didn't get it. What we didn't know is that there was an American spy who, for a bunch of money, sold the plans to the Germans before the war, and they developed their own bomb sight that was less complex, but they thought better than our design. And so all this time, we're trying to keep this thing secret, and the Germans already had a sight built off the same model because of this spy who got a hold of the plans before we got into the war. So everyone knew about the Germans and the Americans both were using a similar design from this Swiss engineer, Norden. Now here's an interesting part. So this woman, Mary Brown, as this newspaper article tells, she had hair that had never been bleached or colored or touched with a curling iron, etc. And it was really long. And she donated it to the US military. And what this says is that it was used in the Norden bomb sight to make the crosshairs, because hair was what they needed for humidity, blah, blah, blah. I don't know all the details. However, depending on where you look, some people believe this to be true. For sure, she donated her hair. We know that. However, what we don't know is what exactly the Air Force used it for. People say it was used in this Norden bomb sight, but a lot of people say that's just the biggest myth from World War II. That's not actually true. So down here's a picture of air crew with an armed guard protecting the Norden site. Again, the Germans already had their own. But anyway, so this, it says right here, Mary didn't find out until 1987 what exactly her hair was used for. She didn't accept any money or anything for giving her hair, but she said she cried for 2 months after she donated it. Now this is a letter from President Ronald Reagan, 1987. It says, I was pleased to learn of your strong love for our nation and how you donated your hair to the war effort during World War II and its use as crosshairs for the Norden bomb sight. So obviously Reagan believes the myth, if it's a myth. So you can do your own research and figure that out. Helping our bombardiers sight enemy ground targets in Europe and the Pacific, etc., etc. So that's a thing, right? To get a letter from Ronald Reagan. Also important, just looking at the different kinds of ships. We've kind of mentioned this before, but we're going to talk about the Battle of Leyte Gulf here. Important to understand that the biggest ships were battleships. Then the aircraft carrier obviously have the planes, heavy cruiser, light cruiser, destroyer, and there's a smaller boat than a destroyer called the destroyer escort. Destroyers were anti-sub, submarine, etc. So you can just see size difference. A destroyer compared to a battleship, not very big. And then looking at aircraft carriers, so this is U.S. aircraft carriers through time, but really the CV, so you saw it back here, CV aircraft carrier. CV was the World War II era aircraft carrier. And then we have the CVE, which was called an escort carrier, or sometimes they were nicknamed the Jeep. And so some of these would be sunk by the Japanese at Leyte Gulf. So that gives you an idea of, like, they're roughly, look, half the size of one of our big fleet carriers. Okay, so here's a map showing you the main happenings at the Battle of Saipan. So you might recognize some of these ideas from the video, the documentary. So we land on June 15. So D-Day was June 6, 1944. So just over a week later, on the other side of the world, we have an invasion force, which is almost as big as the D-Day force, landing
on this little island in the Marianas. And remember, the goal was to capture this island so that we could put our B-29 bombers to bomb mainland Japan. We hadn't bombed mainland Japan since the Doolittle raid years before. So number 10 here, Japanese launch all-out bombsight attack, hitting the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 105th Infantry, etc. July 6th and 7. So that's the, in the video, they talk about that, right? That I kind of muted out the carnage, but how they, thousands, 3,000 to 5,000 Japanese do like a suicide charge against our lines and almost overrun us. We literally had to take our big artillery guns, those 105 howitzers, and put them flat and shoot right into them. And a lot of heroics from our men to keep the Japanese from completely overrunning us, because we were not expecting this type. This was one of the worst Japanese charges of the war, this human wave of Japanese attacking us. So we're going to look at 3 Medal of Honor winners from the Battle of Saipan. The first one here, Thomas Baker, U.S. Army. Here is his Medal of Honor citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty at Saipan. When his entire company was held up by fire of automatic weapons and small arms from strongly fortified enemy positions that commanded the view of the company, Sergeant Baker voluntarily took a bazooka and dashed alone to within 100 yards of the enemy through heavy rifle and machine gun fire that was directed at him by the enemy. He knocked out the strong point, enabling his company to assault the ridge. Some days later, while his company advanced across the open field, flanked with obstructions and places of concealment from the enemy, Sergeant Baker again voluntarily took up a position in the rear to protect the company against surprise attack and came upon 2 heavily fortified enemy pockets manned by 2 officers and 10 enlisted men, which had been bypassed. Without regard for such superior numbers, he unhesitatingly attacked and killed all of them. 500 yards farther, he discovered 6 men of the enemy who had concealed themselves behind our lines and destroyed all of them. On July 7th of July, 1944, the perimeter of which Sergeant Baker was a part was attacked by from 3 sides by from 3,000 to 5,000 Japanese. That's that charge I just mentioned. During the early stages of this attack, Sergeant Baker was seriously wounded, but he insisted on remaining in the line and fired at the enemy at ranges sometimes as close as 5 yards until his ammunition ran out. Without ammunition, with his own weapon battered to uselessness from hand-to-hand combat, he was carried about 50 yards to the rear by a comrade who was then himself wounded. At this point, Sergeant Baker refused to be moved any farther, stating that he preferred to be left to die rather than risk the lives of any more of his friends. A short time later, at his request, he was placed in a sitting position against a small tree. Another comrade withdrawing offered assistance. Sergeant Baker refused, insisting that he be left alone and be given a soldier's pistol with its remaining 8 rounds of ammunition. That'd be like the Colt 45 that the one guy fired in his video. When last seen alive, Sergeant Baker was propped against a tree, pistol in hand, calmly facing the foe. Later, Sergeant Baker's body was found in the same position, gun empty, with 8 Japanese lying dead before him. His deeds were in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Army. What an amazing act of heroism, right? Jesus said, "No greater love hath a man than this, than he gives his life for his friends." Sergeant Baker gave his life for his friends and was a hero. And that's why I'm showing you this Medal of Honor citation, is so that even 70 years later, you know who this man was. Next, Ben Salomon, another Medal of Honor winner, perhaps one of the most unlikely Medal of Honor winners in World War II. He tried to get into the military in the 1930s, was refused, so he went to school and became a dentist. And then during the war, he was drafted, and originally he trained as a machine gunner. But he was put in he was taken from his unit and put to work as a surgeon. So in the Battle of Saipan, he took over in a field tent doing surgery because the other battle surgeon had been wounded. And here is his story. So Captain Ben Salomon was serving at Saipan in the Mariana Islands on July 7, 1944 as a surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. The regiment's 1st and 2nd Battalions were attacked by an overwhelming force between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese soldiers. It was one of the largest attacks attempted in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Although both units fought furiously, the enemy soon penetrated the battalion's combined perimeter and inflicted overwhelming casualties. This happened at night or the early hours of the morning, by the way. In the first minutes of the attack, approximately 30 wounded soldiers walked, crawled, or were carried into Captain Salomon's aid station. And the small tent soon filled with wounded men. As the perimeter began to be overrun, it became increasingly difficult for Captain Salomon, Salomon to work on the wounded. He then saw a Japanese soldier bayoneting one of the wounded soldiers lying near the tent. Firing from a squatting position, he quickly killed the enemy soldier. Then, as he turned his attention back to the wounded, 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared in the front of the entrance of the tent. As these enemy soldiers were killed, 4 more crawled under the tent walls. Rushing them, he kicked the knife out of the hand of one, shot another, bayoneted a third, and then he butted the 4th enemy soldier in the stomach. Some people say he headbutted him. And a wounded comrade then shot and killed the enemy soldier. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Captain ordered the wounded to make their way as best they could back to the regimental aid station while he attempted to hold off the enemy until they were clear. He then grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded and rushed out of the tent. After 4 men were killed while manning a machine gun, he took control of it. When his body was later found, 98 dead Japanese soldiers were piled in front of his position. His extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the U.S. Army. Here's the crazy thing. Well, this was all crazy. I hope you're in awe of this man. He's a dentist who could have retreated with the wounded. Instead, he decides to cover them. Again, that same text, Jesus talking about the greater love has no man. He gave his life to save these wounded men. And they said that when they went back to find his body, they could see the blood trail where they think he moved the machine gun at least 4 different times while he was severely wounded to try to better defend the retreat. Also, he had 70-some wounds in his body, and they think at least 20-some of them happened while he was still alive. And then the Japanese ripped into him significantly after he was dead. So now you'd think that he'd be a shoo-in for the Medal of Honor because of his great heroic deeds. However, because he was a part of the medical battalion, he was not allowed to fire a weapon offensively. So the original request was denied. So then they petitioned and said, well, whoa, he wasn't firing weapons offensively. He was defending other wounded men. So medical personnel can fire weapons. That's not against the Geneva Convention. That was the problem. And so they said he was firing in defense. Well, the problem was then they said that he was firing a machine gun, and a machine gun is not considered a personal weapon. So they, on this technicality, they wouldn't give him the Medal of Honor, which is just ridiculous. It took until I think it was George Bush in 2002 who actually awarded him the Medal of Honor, and I don't remember that date specifically, but it was much later, well after the war, obviously 50 plus years after the war was over, that he finally was awarded the Medal of Honor, and they awarded it to a man who in his honor, who fought to get this Medal of Honor for Captain Ben. And now the medal, I believe, is at the University of Southern California, where he went to school to be a dentist. So there's another amazing story of a Medal of Honor winner in this war, in this battle. I got one more for you. All right, so this is Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, and we'll see from his citation that he died while manning a 50 caliber machine gun, like we watched the demonstration of, in a Jeep. So let's read his citation. The President of the U.S., in the name of Congress, takes pride in presenting the Medal of Honor, posthumously, which means after he was dead, to Lieutenant Colonel William Joseph O'Brien, U.S. Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty at Saipan, Mariana Islands, from June 20 through July 7, 1944, again serving with the 105th. When assault elements of his platoon were held up by intense enemy fire, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien ordered 3 tanks to precede the assault companies in an attempt to knock out the strong point. Due to direct enemy fire, the tank turrets were closed, causing the tanks to lose direction and to fire into our own troops. So the tanks if you can imagine being in one of these tanks, you're getting shot at by the enemy and you kind of lose track of who's who and you're shooting the wrong way. So Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, with complete disregard for his own safety, dashed into full view of the enemy, ran to the leader's tank and pounded on the tank with his pistol butt to attract 2 of the tank's crew, and mounting the tank fully exposed to enemy fire, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien personally directed the assault until the enemy strong point had been liquidated. That alone is amazing. Then on June 28, 1944, while his platoon was attempting to take a bitterly defended high ridge in the vicinity of Norden, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien arranged to capture the ridge by a double envelopment movement of 2 large combat battalions. He personally took control of the maneuver. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien crossed 1,200 yards of sniper-infested underbrush alone to arrive at a point where one of his platoons was being held up by the enemy. Leaving some men to contain the enemy, he personally led 4 men into a narrow ravine behind and killed or drove off all the Japanese manning that strong point. In this action, he captured 5 machine guns and 1 77 millimeter field piece, which would be like an artillery weapon. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien then organized 2 platoons for night defense and against repeated counterattacks directed them. Meanwhile, he managed to hold ground. On the 7th of July, so that's that massive attack, again, 3,000 to 5,000 Japanese, with bloody hand-to-hand fighting in progress everywhere, their forward positions were finally overrun by the sheer weight of the enemy numbers. With many casualties and ammunition running low, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien refused to leave the front lines. Striding up and down the lines, he fired at the enemy with a pistol in each hand. Amazing. Pistol in each hand. And his presence there bolstered the spirits of his men, encouraging them in their fight and sustained them in their heroic stand. Right, you got waves and waves of Japanese attacking you in the night, and here's your commanding officer with pistol in each hand saying, stay in your positions and keep firing. And because if you turn and run, if you retreat, you're going to get overwhelmed and they're all going to die, right? So you got to stay and fight the best you can. And he knew that. So he saved, who knows how many men's lives, how many of, sorry, I can't talk anymore. Just so, what's the word? I'm so inspired. Maybe that's not the right word. I'm so in awe of the bravery of these men. And so he's saving their lives. Again, greater love hath no man. So he refused. Okay, then he's seriously wounded. He refuses to be evacuated. After his pistol ammo was exhausted, he manned a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on a Jeep, an Amadeus, and continued firing. When at last seen alive, he was standing upright, firing into the Jap hordes that were enveloping him. Sometime later, his body was found surrounded by enemy he had killed. His valor was consistent with the highest traditions of the service. So in this huge battle, this pivotal moment, like the Japanese knew, in fact, their military leader, Hideki Tojo, knew that if they lost Saipan, there was a good chance they were going to lose the war. It was that pivotal. They had 30,000 men there and to defend it. And it took this type of heroics, this type of love of your fellow comrade to fight to the death in spite of overwhelming odds. These 3 men, and no doubt if they were still alive, if they had survived this, they would tell you that they weren't the heroes. It was the other guys around them that were heroic too. These are just the stories we know. But hopefully this gives you some appreciation of what these men went through at that night, July 7th, being attacked by thousands of Japanese, and what it took to survive that. And hopefully you're as in awe as I am. So this is on the Japanese side of things. This is their commander, Sato, who, when his charge of 3,000 to 5,000 men did not work, he committed ritualistic suicide. That's called harakiri, or seppuku. Means that you take a sword and cut your stomach open and die a miserable death. That's what the samurai had done. And then this is like an example of a bunker in a cave inside this mountain that the Japanese at Saipan fought in a different way. They buried themselves in caves and bunkers in the hills, and that's why it was so hard for us to root them out, because they were so well entrenched in their hills and caves. Okay, so that kind of concludes this battle. What we're going to say about it. You saw that in the video, the thousands of civilians who committed suicide as well, in a ritual they called Yukusai, which means the shattering of a jewel. The Emperor Hirohito basically demanded of his people that type of devotion. So hopefully you found this interesting. Hopefully these Medal of Honor winners and the weapon demonstrations you found educational. And until next time.